We always start Tuesday group with community announcements. So I'm going to share the microphone soon, but I have not really an announcement, but just a soapbox that I want to get on, which is not what everyone should do. But I've been reading this book called The Art of Gathering, How We Meet and Why It Matters by Priya Parker. And I've been really enjoying it. And I've been thinking about how many events I host and how, we have 46 Tuesday group programs a year, which is an event that we gather for. And the main premise of the book right now is that being intentional about gathering is important. And the first thing to be intentional about is why. Why are you gathering? And getting really, 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 really specific about that. And so I'm just going to read you a passage from this book and share some ruminations on it. Ask not what your country can do for your gathering, but what your gathering can do for your country. It is a little bit cheesy. It's kind of like a self-helpy book. It is what it is. Priya writes, I often press my clients and friends to think about what larger needs in the world their gathering might address. What problems might it help solve? Again, this may sound like too much to ask for a chamber of commerce or a church group, but if you think the problem of your country is that people from disparate tribes no longer know one another or communicate honestly with one another, that kind of insight and theory of the case can translate very plainly into a purpose of using your gathering to collide different tribes. And I think that's one of the many things we do here. And I know another one of the many things we do here is we practice nuance and learning layers of information about complicated things while sitting next to our neighbors, perhaps with whom we are colliding tribes. And that's why I love Tuesday group, because we have a very specific purpose and it's really righteous. And I really appreciate that y'all come here to do that and that we get to do it together. Well, I am so pleased to have y'all back together. We get to learn about something very important. And I'm going to bring my friend Linda Bergum up here to introduce our special speakers today. Welcome, Linda. Thank you. Oh, thank you all for coming. This is a wonderful turnout and I really appreciate it. I would like to introduce our two speakers. Tatiana Bergum, who is my niece, so be kind, and her family live in Duluth, Minnesota. She's a wife, mother, and social justice advocate. For the past 5 years, she has worked with survivors in anti-trafficking and mental health. Tatiana has a powerful story of her own that fuels her heart for the issue of youth experiencing sexual violence. Prior to anti-trafficking work, Tatiana worked in Washington, D.C., doing communications and federal policy work. Most recently, Tatiana worked as a federal contractor with the U.S. Department of Health and Human Services Office on Trafficking in Persons, sometimes called OTIP. She provided national training and technical assistance as part of OTIP's National Human Trafficking Training and Technical Assistance Center, where she had the opportunity to train systems, communities, and organizations across the country on the issues of trafficking. She has extensive experience in community planning and collaboration, nonprofit strategy, and state legislative and policy work around the issue of commercial sexual exploitation of youth and children. Mel Alvar is a community advocate, public health educator, and human trafficking subject matter expert from Duluth, Minnesota. Mel is a 2023 National Human Trafficking Training and Technical Assistance Center Human Leadership Academy Cohort 8 Fellow. Mel's current work at the Safe Harbor Regional Navigator for Northeast Minnesota as the program for aid to victims of sexual assault connects her to communities and professionals across the region to build capacity for walking alongside individuals and families impacted by exploitation and human trafficking. For nearly 20 years, Mel has been involved in harm reduction, gender-based violence prevention, and outreach efforts in the Twin Ports area of Duluth, Minnesota, and Superior, Wisconsin. Mel is fiercely passionate about improving equity, assisting families in navigating complicated systems, and lowering the barriers that folks impacted by violence encounter on their healing journey. Mel is a mother, jewelry artist, business owner of Traveling Beads by Melissa, a podcaster. Her podcast is Parent Chat, and a CrossFit athlete in recovery with lived experience of intimate partner trauma and exploitation. So thank you for coming, and here are Tatiana and Mel.
So much for having us. It was so nice to hear the community announcements. I felt like a part of the community. Like, I want to come and learn stained glass and like come here to see through.
Yeah, I feel like we're among our people in some ways, so we're happy to be here, and thank you so much for the kind introduction. And Linda, who is family, and Dave, his family, it's really an honor to be here as well with them. So yeah, we're excited to be here, and we're gonna just kind of jump in. The one thing that we did want to say is we often do trainings and presentations together. We have done work in the Duluth and Minnesota, actually all over the state, training together, but we started by really working together through PAVSA and through the previous organization that I had worked for, helping youth who had survived sexual assault, who had survived trafficking and exploitation. And really, we saw a gap in the community, a need for training. And so that is what we started doing. We've been doing it for really the past 5 years together. And so I have since kind of stepped out of the role I was previously in, but still really happy to be here with Mel, my partner in crime. So this is really an honor to be here with her too. So we're excited. So we wanted to just touch on, I feel like, we wanted to just do some housekeeping things. What we're talking about today is extremely intense. We're talking about violence, we're talking about harm to children and youth. And so we just want to be very open and hold space for what we're talking about is extreme. So please just be aware of your own emotions and our own experiences that we bring into spaces like this. If you need to step out, if you need to do anything, do what you need to do to take care of yourself, and no offense to us or anything like that. And whatever you need to do afterwards as well, make sure you're just taking a minute after this presentation to take breath and just acknowledge the heaviness of what we're talking about today. The other thing is just the language and imagery. We are going to be sharing the details of what sexual violence is. We're going to talk about terminology. We're going to talk about state laws. But again, like what we just talked about, we're talking about sexual violence and trafficking. We're going to dive deeper into some of those terms. So just an acknowledgement of that. And then also we're going to talk about myth versus fact. We all come into this space with things that we have seen in the media, things that we feel we might understand about human trafficking. But we're going to kind of dispel some of those myths, as Mel and I have seen them throughout our careers working on this issue.
So to jump right into what human trafficking isn't, we want to address some of those common misconceptions right off the bat. When we think about human trafficking, too, sometimes we're seeing those images and stories that are highlighting like everyone's getting kidnapped into trafficking. The victim looks a certain way or is a certain gender. The trafficker is identified as a certain gender or a certain race. So it does not always involve kidnappers, involve stranger kidnapping, very similar to sexual violence, like 80% or greater. It is somebody that the person knows. So the person knows. So we'll kind of get into what that looks like in the dynamics, but just to set the record straight with that. Sometimes the images we see of human trafficking, the posters, the flyers, involve people who have their mouths covered, their hands chained, they're tied to something. It doesn't always involve that kind of captivity. Again, we'll get into that with the dynamics, but a lot of it is psychological chains that are keeping people stuck in these situations. They don't actually need to be held captive physically in some situations. It can happen. And human trafficking doesn't always involve crossing borders. We know folks who have been trafficked right out of their own apartments, right out of their own homes. So transportation to another state or another community does not need to happen for it to be considered trafficking, while it can happen. And so just baseline, human trafficking impacts individuals across ages, genders, race, and economic status. So it can impact anybody. And again, we'll get into kind of the specific things that traffickers and exploiters are looking to target. But really anybody can be at risk at any point in their life for things that are completely out of their control. And then it is also impacting urban and rural communities. We do get the question a lot of the time, like, show us the data. How many people are being trafficked at any given time? Just because of the nature of this crime, we don't have those type of numbers exactly. But we do have a little snapshot that we'll show in a little bit from something called the Minnesota Student Survey, where there was a question introduced into that survey to just kind of get a tiny snapshot of what it may be looking like as far as demographics and things that are intersecting with it. But there are websites out there like Polaris Project. All of those have to do with how many people are reporting. So if you're looking for data, we can help point you in that direction. Just know that we're not coming here with like really super solid numbers. And again, like Tatiana said, a lot of it's based on our own experience, what we have seen in the work on the ground, doing the work throughout Northeast Minnesota.
So when we think about responding to human trafficking, there's two approaches that really can be done at a state level and a community level. Those two approaches that you'll see are the criminal justice approach, which really, it gives a legal framework and is really justice oriented. So our neighboring state of Wisconsin, for example, has a very heavy criminal justice approach and how they handle it. The Department of Justice really focuses in on how survivors funnel through the system. And so there's also a focus on punishment of traffickers and then recovery of victims. And so then on the other side of things, we have what's called a public health approach. Minnesota really takes on this public health approach. And so it's really focused on preventative support around individual, relationship, community, cultural, and society systems. And then also the identification, which in Minnesota, there's a model called no wrong door model, which Mel will talk about a little bit later on. But really the purpose is that a survivor or anyone who's experienced sexual violence can go into any organization and get care and support and trauma-informed care. And there's an understanding of what trafficking looks like and what it is. And then also a long-term support and holistic services. So these two approaches, there is a space for both of them. The one is not above the other per se, but what we really want to hone in on is that the criminal justice approach is not always the ideal approach for a survivor. A survivor may not be focused on going through the criminal justice system or even go through that with their trafficker. And so that public health approach can really come in and provide the support that's needed around housing, mental health support, some of those barriers as well.
So like Tatiana said, Minnesota has this no wrong door model. So the law was passed back in 2011, went into effect 2014, because we wanted a framework in place. We didn't just want to pass TVAP, Trafficking Victims Protection Act, to say that anyone under the age of 18 should not be arrested or prosecuted for the crime of prostitution. Prostitution is a very legal term. It holds a lot of stigma. This is another piece of language that we're trying to move away from because of that criminal justice framework. So we have this no wrong door model, like Tatiana mentioned, that essentially says that if anyone, a youth walks into any agency, they should be able to recognize any potential signs of exploitation, offer services voluntarily, and respond in a trauma-informed way. And then also we took it a step further and put positions like mine in place. And we'll show a map in a little bit of the state is divided up into 11 regions. So we have this point of contact where communities, professionals, anyone can come to and say, like, where do I start? I need services, I need training. And it's all in partnership with public health, law enforcement, BCA, child protection. It's all of these systems working together on this issue to make sure to mobilize through increased awareness, to mobilize for youth outreach and community outreach, safety through child welfare system. Again, moving away from that criminal justice framework before, I think even before we officially moved it through to be the no wrong door model, we almost did like a diversion program. So instead of getting arrested with criminal charges, we would divert them. And so we wanted to get rid of all of that and say, we want all of these services to be trauma informed, where youth have that option. Is very similar to substance use treatment. If we don't get that buy-in from that person in the beginning and help them to see that it's their choice, they're gonna have this support, take it or leave it, we're here when you're ready. Like people, well, first of all, youth don't like to be told what to do. I still don't like to be told what to do, but to tell somebody like, okay, we've identified that you're a victim, you have to do this, how easily it is for them to see like, wait a minute, you said I'm a victim, but you're locking me up. So wait, why are you punishing me? And a lot of the time we go, oh, it's because we need to protect you. Well, then give me tools and resources, because we're moving away from that rescue. We are not, I'll tell you right now, Tatiana and I are not out here rescuing people. We're walking alongside them. Let us show you that there's a different way, that there are people out here who care about you. Let's show you some resiliency skills, teach you some safety tools, harm reduction, that's harm reduction. And then we're setting them up for this path towards healing that they feel in control of. Because if you're just plucking people out, oh, rescue mission, here you go, you're on your way, they learn nothing. And we kept seeing people go back. I mean, we still see people go back.
Of course, but
They're connected.
a piece of it is, and this is why we are so passionate about coming into communities, is because without the community support around young people, we aren't gonna essentially see any change or shift, right? As the more young people feel seen and heard in their community, and they're uplifted through jobs and housing in other areas, that's when we really can see the prevention and them not going back into the systems that they maybe came out of.
So this is just, the map is changing. We got more money this past legislative session for another navigator. So we came from like 5 navigators, I think, in the beginning with giant geographical regions to now we'll have 10. So this Northwest region will be getting another one. But essentially the Safe Harbor Network involves regional navigators, supportive services that are based out of agencies already doing the work. So youth serving agencies, sexual assault programs, domestic violence programs, legal services, case management, and then DHS, that's all funded through MDH, and then Department of Human Services funds the emergency shelter, transitional housing, and handles child protection side of things. So services look very different. All of this can be found MDH Safe Harbor, find any services within those regions. Of course, we're seeing the gaps though, right? All of our services in Northeast region are all centralized in Duluth. But just the good thing about what we're able to do with Safe Harbor services though, is we can expand our reach. So a lot of those services will do outreach in the greater region and don't have to just be centralized. So it does look different in different areas. And trust me, we are fighting for greater Minnesota and not to have all the services centralized and down in the metro.
And then before we move off of some of the state stuff, I want to say that Minnesota is really leading the way in their approach to working with youth and the issue of trafficking. So the difference between other states, there's many other states across the country who have a safe harbor law, and we'll get into that too. But what makes Minnesota different is that they attach a budget to that law. And so we have funding that funnels through the Minnesota Department of Health and the Department of Health and Human Services into organizations and grants and so on and so forth, and to fund positions like MELS or other agencies to get funding. So that makes this across the country, that makes Minnesota a little different.
This is just a little snapshot of kind of why we're doing things the way that we do things in our response. We have the youth and the family in the middle. And this network of support, because it is a multidisciplinary approach to this issue. Not one of us should be doing this isolated from each other. So it is a multidisciplinary response. Regional navigators can help pull in these different folks to make sure that we're wrapping services around youth and families and getting down to the bottom really of what their needs are to be living a happy and healthy life.
So the Minnesota Safe Harbor terminology, commercial sexual exploitation, this definition is that when someone exchanges sex for anything of value or a promise of anything of value, that can be a basic need, substances, a higher status, and maybe a gang or some type of group, protection of any kind, rent or gear of some sort. And we are always really, so this is terminology based on Minnesota law of what commercial sexual exploitation is. And so it's a very, human trafficking, it's a very umbrella term, but commercial sexual exploitation falls under that. And this is the definition. But when we do work, we really hone in on that. If anything of value is anything of value to that young person, not just this list here. And so when we're thinking of what a youth might exchange for, there might be an exchange for, it can be cigarettes, it can be really anything that young person needs in that moment. So when we do work, we're very careful not to find that.
Sorry. So breaking down sex trafficking. So we have human trafficking, we have commercial sexual exploitation, and then sex trafficking is a form of commercial sexual exploitation. Where this comes into play is where there's a third party involved. So commercial sexual exploitation might look like survival sex, like Tatiana explained. So an exchange between two people. And then when it becomes sex trafficking is when there's that third party who is benefiting and involved in the situation. And that can be, again, anything of profit, any kind of benefit or that false promise of a benefit. And those are our statutes listed there as well. So the part where it's different from our federal law, which I don't think we define federal law. The federal law states that for anyone over the age of 18, you have to prove force, fraud, or coercion. But in Minnesota, it's by any means, and anyone under the age of 18 legally cannot consent to trading sex for something of value. So this is where it can get tricky sometimes when it gets to the legal stuff. And where I think some folks get missed because they're like, well, we have the age of consent law. But if something of value is traded, it does not, like, consent legally is not recognized if it's exchanged for something of value for survival or otherwise. And that person deserves to have access to services. And then labor exploitation and trafficking, that's okay, you can, that's fine. I am not an expert on the labor exploitation and trafficking, but we need to also recognize that is a piece, and I think sometimes could be happening at higher rates than I think commercial sexual exploitation, because it can be even more deeply hidden in our society. But labor exploitation is for services involving violation of labor laws, protecting how workers are treated, how much and when they're paid, health and safety in the workplace, and how children under the age of 18, how they can work, and it may involve wage theft. And then trafficking does need to involve force, fraud, or coercion by Minnesota statute and by federal definition. And we do also see youth be at very high risk of labor exploitation as well. In our consumer-driven society, they want the new iPhone, they want the new clothes, and so they can be tricked very easily into taking a job that's not what they signed up for. Essentially, that could be labor exploitation. You're not getting the full picture of what you're being asked to do for work and receiving those benefits that you legally are able to have.
All right, so just a few other terminology. Child abuse material is any content that's sexually explicit activities involving children. Self-generated child sexual abuse material is explicit imagery of a child that appears to have been taken by the child in the image. It can result from a coercive or consensual experience. Consensual experience is often referred to as sexting or sharing nudes. When we're working with young people, this is just a piece and a reality of their world and their dating life sometimes too. And so we do a lot around internet safety, the importance of helping youth understand their own autonomy when they're sending these photos, as well as the laws that can play out as they go back and forth with these photos as well. You want to?
Just some other terms to be aware of with young folks too, again, in our consumer-driven society and how expensive the cost of living is these days. Something else that's popping up more and more is sugar dating. So that someone, essentially, it's a transactional relationship that could involve photos or going on dates, but one person who needs money is a sugar baby to someone who has power and money. So that's a sugar dating situation. Just having an Instagram. I am getting direct messages all of the time. Let me pay your bills. And my husband will joke and be like, yeah, we got debt. And I'm like, yeah, but that's not like, we don't, that's not what it always turns out to be, because and this is something we're actually, I've done deep dives in before. I have yet to hear that it actually turns out to be just as easy as come out to dinner with me and I'll pay all your bills. It usually ends up being very exploitative. We know of people who have been trafficked through sugar dating. And there are websites out there targeting like young college students. Look at how much debt has been paid off by being a sugar baby. So the power dynamics is still very off. So it's something to be aware of out there. And yeah, it's funny to joke about, but because we all have debt, and who wouldn't just want someone to pay off our debt for us? But my question is always like, but what are you gonna want in return? Like, this sounds too good to be true, but young minds don't always think like that. And then sextortion is something that we are just seeing explode across the internet right now. That's a form of blackmail where sexual information or images are used to extort financially or sexual benefits from a victim. So this could be starting an online chat, whatever, send me a pic, and then later becomes threats. If you don't send me money, if you don't send me more photos, I'm gonna do this to you. And there's actually a Hulu documentary on this, warning, it goes very in depth. This is where we're seeing young boys across the country completing suicide because they don't know what to do. And the threats are so real and so scary. So this is something we're trying to get just information out there of like, stop, block, and tell somebody, because it's rising to the level of emergency. And then revenge porn we're seeing is something happening within relationships. Maybe at one time there was consensual photos sent back and forth, the relationship ends, and then there's threats to share those images. And we do now have statutes that are protecting folks against that information, against revenge porn. And there is help out there. There is also help out there on like NCMEC, like Take It Down, where if people think that their images have been shared online, I don't know all the techie stuff, but they can like scrub the internet to like find where these photos are. So there are resources out there now. So these are just some things to be aware of that are affecting our young people out there as they're navigating online spaces. Okay, so Minnesota student survey data. I'm gonna skip over that real quick. So it's this new question was given to 9th and 11th graders. Have you ever traded sex or sexual activity to receive money, food, drugs, alcohol, a place to stay, or anything else? 2019 was the first time this question was added. This survey comes out every 3 years. There's passive parental consent to engage in it. Youth have to be in school the day it's given. School districts, it's across the board. Not every school district participates, but enough did in this 2019 survey that 1.4% of Minnesota students answered yes. And that's at least 5,000 students in Minnesota who disclosed trading sex for something of value. How that breaks down is the safe harbor regions. So again, we can't just say this is a metro issue because we're seeing higher numbers across rural Minnesota where youth are being exploited, trading sex for something of value.
This goes back to the myth. So a myth that we often hear is that we hear that it's happening more in metro areas, the cities, Chicago, Madison, all those areas, you know, I hear all the time, Highway 35 from Duluth all the way to Texas. Yes, right, we know it's happening. But what we are seeing now, we have proof for in Minnesota, is that it is happening in rural areas more than it is happening in the metro areas. And so we need to be aware of that. We need to be able to understand why it's happening. So part of you all being here today, especially being in Ely, which is a very rural area of Minnesota, is so crucial. And we just want to highlight that.
The other thing to highlight is that we typically only hear that this is mostly happening to young girls, right? This was something that us advocates were finally able to see numbers from, is that almost at the same rates boys, cisgender boys are disclosing exploitation, 1.2%. So cisgender is those youth whose gender identity aligns with the sex assigned at birth, almost the same. And then very unfortunately, we also weren't surprised to see that those youth who are gender diverse, identify as trans, or gender expansive are experiencing exploitation at the highest rates in our state. So again, we need to be creating safer spaces for these youth. There's a lot to unpack with the gender identity piece of it. But mostly I just wanted to highlight that like there is no denying anymore that this isn't happening to our young boys. And then similarly, while we're seeing this impact folks across the race spectrum, it shouldn't be any surprise that we're seeing those races who are experiencing marginalization and oppression at higher rates are also disclosing trafficking at higher rates. So that piece is important to note as well. And then the last piece, there's 2 more pieces. So relevant life experiences, things that are intersecting. 12% of youth who disclosed trading sex were in a juvenile correction facility, have ever been in foster care. I think this number is actually higher with the recent survey, unfortunately. So we're seeing these as huge intersections of youth who are impacted. Had ever experienced sexual violence, 7.7% had disclosed trading sex, unstable housing in the past year, 6.4%, and had attended an ALC. So all this information you can find, it was the School of Nursing, the MISS project that did these debriefing forms for us. It's kind of dark in the corner there, but the Minnesota Youth Sex Trading Project. And then the last piece I just want to mention quickly is that they, aside from their experience of victimization, right? We don't always like to just be known for our victimization. We also want to highlight that these are youth who have hopes and dreams for their future. They have other things going on. And 63% of them had disclosed that they have dreams of higher education and work and training career, 17%, hopes of joining the military, 7%, and 14% had other plans. So that's all the data really that we're going to share today that we really have. The numbers look differently because the last survey was given during COVID. So in another 3 years, we'll see this survey come out and just continue to build to see what the trends are gonna be as things are changing, and the times are changing.
Yeah, let's take a breath for a minute. That's a lot of information. All right, so we're gonna dive into protective factors and resiliency. So with all of those numbers, every time we read those off, we're heartbroken by those numbers. But we keep coming back to the protective factors and the resilience of young people that we meet with. In a community setting, that really looks like support, connection, belonging, like I said earlier. As long as a youth and a community is working to uphold youth in their community and make space for them, have safe jobs. Like one thing Mel and I have done is train restaurants or places like Starbucks where youth hang out, businesses that youth are going to. I always say in a small town like Walmart is a youth center without being a youth center. So any place that youth are going, it's important that we are watching out for them, protecting them, training staff in those areas. We do a lot of healthy coping skills and in making sure that youth have creative outlets. Like I was thinking of the woman who talked about doing stained glass. Like we often would bring youth to art groups, just places that they can start to be creative, and some of those, that trauma can come out as well when we're in those settings. Positive role models that look like them, especially important for trans and non-binary youth. We need to have representation across the board when we're looking at service providers. Any spaces that young people are going into, they need to be able to see themselves a little bit and the person talking to them and trying to support them. Access to resources, safety skills, and education. Mel and I are really will always be an advocate for harm reduction strategies, how to help youth be safe in maybe an unsafe situation. If that is a situation that they get themselves into, or things might, they might need to, whatever it looks like, we just want to make sure that youth have the skills and the ability to identify those safety pieces around them. Education to rights and body autonomy. This is why places like, for example, PAVSA in Duluth, for us, is so crucial in our community, because they're really going out and talking with young people about the laws and helping them understand the rights, and especially in high school spaces where youth are experiencing sexual violence or intimate partner violence. What does that look like? And then also access to cultural, religious, and traditional practices, which is extremely crucial in the healing process as well.
Just to go back to the education piece, there is a way to do trafficking prevention education without ever saying sex trafficking. It's talking about consent and healthy relationship dynamics and internet safety. And there is absolutely information and resources out there for age appropriate kind of information.
Yeah, that is, I mean, that is one, sorry. That is one thing we often hear is how, you know, we want to come into a high school setting or even like a church setting, but the parents don't always want us talking about sex or sexual violence or the issue of trafficking. And we just say that's okay because we can talk about it without ever talking about same-sex trafficking.
Yeah, we've done it. I was challenged with that question long ago and I rose to the occasion. There's a lot more information out there now than there was before. So dynamics of trafficking. So to break this down, different types of trafficking that we're seeing in Minnesota. Unfortunately, I think one of the more deeply hidden ones can be harder to detect and identify and even get disclosures from or reports from is familial trafficking. So this is where the parents are trafficking their children. They're being approached by, we've heard of landlords approaching. We know you have a child, your rent is covered, give me access to them. Sometimes there is substance use issues involved in those situations. Sometimes it's a generational thing. The men in the family have been the traffickers and the women have been the one being exploited. And it's just how things have gone through generations. We've also seen situations where there's an unrelated trafficker who's controlling the situation. So in this process, it can be somebody who, there's always usually a grooming process, again, because it's not always stranger kidnapping. It's someone who is somehow gaining access into this person's life. It can be a grooming of one individual, it can be grooming of a family, and it can be grooming of a community. And grooming is that predatory process to gain access, to be able to control somebody, and also get them to look like a co-conspirator, to make it look like it's their idea, that they're consenting to it without knowing how much manipulation is going on behind the scenes. And because that anyone under the age of 18 who is trading sex for something of value, we are also seeing buyer solicitation of minors. So that is an adult person going directly to a child to solicit sex. That is trafficking. And then we are also seeing situations of organized crime networks. So we've seen this in legitimate businesses, we've seen it in illegal businesses, massage parlors, we're seeing a lot come through right now. We quite a few years ago, we had a store called the Hip Hop Candy Shop that was found to be trafficking young girls through it. So by all appearances, and those I'm not an expert in, but they are very organized crime networks. Also, they can be in conjunction with like drug trafficking or other kind of organized crime going on as well. These are not exhaustive lists of where trafficking can happen for both labor and sex. The exchange of things, it can really happen anywhere, but we are seeing it online through webcamming, through that sugar dating, through stripping, through pornography. It's happening in motels and hotels. And the one thing we didn't mention with the law is Minnesota does have a law that if any agency in Minnesota has a lodging license, they are required to have human trafficking training. So something that always helps is if you know of a lodge, hotel, motel, ask if they have their, I think it's annually, they have to have this training to keep their license, and you report that to the Minnesota Department of Health if they don't. But there's new material coming out, they get training upon hire, there's flyers that go up in the back for every different part of operating a hotel, motel. And that was something that we have seen a lot of really good things from, because historically and still we are seeing people being trafficked through hotels and motels. Oh, we actually skipped that one, sorry. Oh, we skipped two of them. Okay, so the vulnerabilities, I didn't want to focus too much on this one. Sorry, I thought we actually skipped, but you can go ahead. Because vulnerabilities can be so.
Yeah, so vulnerabilities traffickers like to exploit. So especially when we're working with youth, we want them to understand, and oftentimes, like Mel said, youth don't like to be told what to do. And oftentimes they feel they have a choice, that they're stepping into something that they decided on their own, which a piece of that is true, right? But sometimes a large piece of what we work with youth is like, why does your age make you vulnerable? There's the power dynamics, there's so many things, but we really want to hone in on telling young people, like, it's not because of your age, you can't help your age. There are things and factors in your life that you have no control over, but exploiters, predators will exploit those things. And so that is a piece of our work, is really helping youth understand, what is someone going to exploit? Like, where am I at in life? And it's not because you may be experiencing housing insecurity or food insecurity, but that's people are out there looking to exploit those pieces of your life. So that's a big piece of it. Systems involvement, youth who are in out of home placement, and especially like in Duluth, we have Lighthouse downtown, and you'll see if you drive down by Lighthouse, if you've heard of it, it's downtown Duluth. And during their busy times, they'll have staff standing outside of those doors protecting youth, because traffickers will make their way around the building waiting for youth to come out. So they know, and just like we do trainings with you all, traffickers, predators, people who prey on young, vulnerable people, they do their own education on us. And so they know the places to go. And so wherever you have a lot of youth hang out, that's you'll find people just out there trying to talk with them and recruit them in certain ways. The lack of a support system, a history of trauma and neglect, economic instability and seen and unseen disabilities. One thing that we are really working on in Minnesota is really how do we support young people who may have a disability? What does that look like? And very important to be mindful of, as well as any unmet mental health concerns, including substance use.
So, like I said, with the grooming process, they're looking for a need to fill. If there's nobody else, if there's no family filling that need, if there's no community supports filling that need, that trafficker will identify that and look to exploit that, to create that dependency, which, you know, we had talked about, you know, youth not wanting to go through the criminal justice system because now they've formed this attachment. And you can't tell me that my boyfriend is my trafficker, right? Because I'm not being kidnapped. I'm not what it looks like in the movies. And so we really have to be mindful of how we're talking to young folks about this and really breaking down those dynamics in relationships. And where are those hard lines? When are you gonna say, like, you are worthy of care and love? And that's not what this is looking like.
Yeah.
And that's one example within an intimate partner relationship, because again, that's what we're seeing a lot of in Duluth. And just one example, not every example.
And another piece too of what we do a lot, and we aren't going to dig into this, but it's important to understand is how trauma plays a role in a young person's life or any of our lives. Is that you know, a lot of the young people we've worked with have experienced some type of sexual assault or sexual violence young in their lives, and so we help youth understand why that might be. Why someone hones in on those things as well. We've seen it time and time again where a young person you know, has experienced maybe some type of sexual violence or sexual abuse in their lives, and traffickers who portray themselves as a boyfriend or girlfriend will come in, get to know them, and really pull those things out of someone and use that against them.
So for potential indicators, there is a tool called the Minnesota Youth Trafficking Exploitation Identification Tool. These are just a couple that there are kind of pretty obvious signs of, like, signs of being controlled, physical and psychological signs of trauma, living conditions, who they're connected to in their life, working conditions. Really, a lot of it is like connected to gut instinct, like this doesn't feel right, this doesn't look right. We're not going to go into this because we don't have time. And also, I've also worked with survivors that haven't had any of these potential indicators. So just know there are a lot of lists out there, but really it gets down to, like, who is this person's support system? What does that support system look like? And do they look like, does it look like something could be a little off with either in their relationships, or it may be unhealthy, or their working situation. But there are lots of lists for potential indicators. Oh, go ahead.
Yep. We're trying to be honorable with the time limit here. But some, you know, we get asked all the time, why didn't they just leave? Like, that is the question that we hear the most, truly is. And even from young people, when we go in and do training in spaces, the teenagers are like, well, why didn't they just walk out the door? Like, well, I would have just left. And so we really always want to, we talk about to youth about victim blaming as well. Like, that's a conversation we have in community spaces, a conversation we have with young people, but really helping you understand that there are many reasons that someone doesn't just walk out the door. The first and foremost thing that we see the most that Mel mentioned earlier was that it's a relationship. Grooming is a relationship between someone who's trying to manipulate a relationship, trying to build that trust of another person. And that makes it much harder to lead because there's that relationship and there's something that was given that other person needed. And that is something that keeps people staying quite often. And so along with that, there's shame, guilt, fear, a lack of language for their experiences. This training that we're doing even and things like laws and terminology is fairly new over the past decade even. But young people, we always can tell if we meet a youth who says, hey, I've experienced trafficking, we know that there was some education done at some point in their lives. They have language to that. But I can count on one hand the amount of young people who come up to me and said, I experienced trafficking, or what I experienced was exploitation. They just don't have the language, or they haven't had the education around what happened to them. they don't have like language to those experiences like we're talking about today. There's often trauma coerced bonding. So what's the other terminology for this? Trauma bonding is what Stockholm syndrome. But what we really want to pull out and step away from is that the person who is really getting manipulated, there is not any responsibility on them or anything that they play in that manipulation tactic of trauma bonding. Or so we call it now trauma coercive bonding. So oftentimes, like there's that relationship built there. Often as well, we haven't touched on this, but many of the youth we work with are parents, and their trafficker might be the father of their children. And so that, of course, brings in a whole other dynamic. And again, just previous negative experiences disclosing or reporting. And that's a whole other training.
Yeah. There's a lot to unpack, so thank you for letting us try to cram this for you into an hour. This in and of itself could be a presentation as well. The impacts all depend on someone's situation, who the trafficker is, who their support systems are, and what the laws are and where it happens. Healing is possible, but it's a long journey and it needs to involve support for all of those pieces. And then I think for the sake of time, we're going to end with this slide and then our last thoughts. So best practices in responding to these pieces is being trauma informed. So trauma informed to me means how can I support you? What do you need right now? Are you hungry? Do you need to sleep? Like that's what I think a lot of people wish they would have heard. And we need to be mindful of our own reactions if people are disclosing to us. And if no one has ever disclosed violence, there might be a lot that we need to work on ourselves then, because it is a gift for someone to disclose. It is hard. It is scary. We don't know what's going to happen. People can be unpredictable. So making sure that we're doing everything in our power not to re-traumatize someone if they're disclosing trauma and having them guide the way. Taking into consideration their cultural considerations. Are there specific things they need based on their religion or their background, things that are really going to help in that healing process? Making sure if we're providing services to highlight youth, family, and survivor voices and choices. It's walking alongside of them, practicing harm reduction. Safety means different things to everybody. When I was on house, safety to me meant I had to stay up to keep myself safe because falling asleep was not safe. Safety to you might look completely different in that situation. Safety to me means I have to have multiple phones, so I might need to steal phones to keep myself safe. So harm reduction really is coming down to practical steps that person can do to keep themselves safe in unsafe situations. And then making sure to include, if you're doing programming, that there's prevention programming and community response and integration and healing. I think we forget about this part, right? Because our culture, society focuses on that rescue. Well, what are they supposed to do after they're rescued? How do they reintegrate back into school? How do they reintegrate back into society? Because we want to do a lot of good. Some of us want to help other survivors after we get through our healing process. How is that how can folks help us get to that point of contributing? And then I've kind of already touched on the response. I'm going to skip over that. You can find it all at MDH. Specifics on prevention, again, can be age appropriate, but we want to land on the final thoughts. Making sure that we're vetting misinformation, having these tough conversations. A piece we don't always cover a ton of, but is a huge piece of this is buyers. What are the conversations we're having with men? There are studies out there mapping the demand for sex in Minnesota, and the majority is men. So what kind of conversations are we having with men about this issue? And that's going to look different for different communities. So having those tough conversations with youth, and folks in the community, having patience and grace. This is a marathon, not a sprint. There are obviously a lot of working pieces, and none of us should be working in silos to do it.
Collaborate, collaborate, collaborate. A couple of opportunities to plug into. If you'd like to get on my listserv, you can email me. We've got a bunch of events coming up for January. A ton of other information. And again, taking good care. What does community care look like, and self-care? So how are you going to debrief today? What conversations are you going to have and process what you've learned here? So our call to action is just where can you plug in? What fits for you? Go to the choir and band concert. Show up for youth in this community. I got chills. I'm like, I'm here for, I would go.
Yeah.
I would go if I was here. So where can you plug in to mentor youth, to be a support person? Because some of the youth targeted at the highest rates have nobody looking out for them, have nobody checking in for them. So any young person in our family, in our circles, they all need us. They need a community to come around them. So I love that you started out with that book in gathering, because it really rang true. I truly believe the closer our community is connected, there is no place for violence. When people feel connected and responsible for each other, that is how we're going to end this issue.
Mic drop right there. Thank you so much for having us, and we have our contact material if you want to have a look.
We'll be around. Yeah, questions? Yeah.
You said that lodging license holders.
Yeah.
Are getting special training. Is that a new thing?
It's so the law is law that anyone with a lodging license has to have training on human trafficking. I think what year was that?
19.
Was it 2019? It's a very recent law, but all the material is out there. And they should already know how to access it. So, yeah, by statute. Yep.
There's
Oh, yeah.
Yeah, they have signs in all of the laboratories.
In the-
They say,
Yeah.
you're involved.
Yeah, she was saying at Quick Trip, we love that, that in the bathrooms, there are, the National Human Trafficking Hotline, posters in the bathrooms there. Yep.
And there was another question I saw, our hand raised over here.
Yeah.
Exploited, like,
Yeah,
then they move into the sexual.
Yeah.
Oh,
Is there a lot of-
absolutely. Oh, yeah.
yeah.
Actually, one of the highest risk factors is if you've experienced labor exploitation, you could be considered at higher risk of sex trafficking, actually. We do see a lot of, lives are complicated, right? So at any given day, depending on the situation, there can be a little bit of both. We also see mixture, we didn't get into coarse criminality, but we've also seen more and more cases coming forward where people are being forced to sell drugs and be sex trafficked.
Yeah.
So that's forced criminality within trafficking. And there's a case out of Utah, Victor Rector. He had taught these youth boys how to be massage therapists. So he taught them the trade, was also sex trafficking them, and they were being forced to sell drugs. So he was being charged with both sex trafficking and labor.
And there's a lot, laws coming down through the state of Minnesota around labor exploitation and labor trafficking. Because we're a farm state, 100% through and through, and so there's a lot that happens throughout farmland.
I can see that ships could be a real problem for trafficking. And I'm wondering if you've been in contact with the Lake Superior Ministry of Seafarers.
I haven't heard of that group actually, but we have a very close relationship with the Duluth Port Authority and Coast Guard, and have and we're hearing, this is the thing too about our experience, what we hear happening is from the mouths of folks being impacted, right? We haven't heard of trafficking on the ships in a very long time since they strengthened security, because prior to 9/11, ships would dock, you could just walk right up. And now you have to get a Twix card to even get in the yard. Were you with me when we did the
Yeah.
field trip with DPD?
Yeah, we went with DPP trying to get through to get on to the shipyard.
We were like followed by security.
But I do want to acknowledge, so we know that it happens
Yeah.
on the ships and
Yeah.
in Duluth, that is something we hear quite often.
Mhm.
We acknowledge it, we know it does happen, and I've seen too where youth are taken, maybe not on a ship or a boat, but there's like other boats, like sailboats
Yeah.
or other boats that they're party hopping essentially and taken from boat to boat.
Mhm.
So we know that it's happening, but what we always say is we really want to share that wider view, because if we only think, all right, Duluth, there's the ports, then we're missing the whole entire picture. So we want to get a wide camera view of it all too.
The seafarers can congregate at the Seafarer Center. And then contacts could be made out from there. So that might be, and the center has been in existence since the late sixties.
Okay. That would be good.
Thank you so much.
Thank you for bringing that up, because I have not heard of that.
Were there any other questions? Yeah.
Would you just tell us what paths are?
Yeah.
Sorry, yeah, I'm, it's the program for aid to victims of sexual assault, thank you.